Hello, and welcome to the No Wrong Notes podcast, a show hosted by me, Veronica Kokis, holistic voice teacher and singer just like you. Grab a cup of tea, relax, and sit back as we discuss all things singing technique, mindset tips, and more so you can show up as the most confident and creative singer you can be. All right, so I am here with Dr. Stephanie Reyes. Thank you so much for coming on the No Wrong Notes podcast.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and dive right in here. I would love it if you could introduce yourself to the listeners, kind of talking about who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are in your career as a choral conductor and vocalist.
Yeah, so that's a loaded question. You got to take it way back. Man, I've been a art and music lover since I was a child, and it all started though in high school. I was planning on signing up for art class, and my dad was like, "No, I did choir. When I was in school, like you should do it. You would love it. You're always singing." And so I did it to appease him. Choir stole my heart. And then I had a director who pulled me aside and was like, "You're auditioning for the varsity choir." And I was like, "Okay, all right." So she kind of just forced me. And from there, it was kind of just like a series of events of supportive educators seeing, potential and talent in me and just really supporting me. My voice teacher in high school, my senior year, she had asked me, "Do you plan on going to college?" And I said, "I don't think that's in the cards for me." I grew up really poor. College never crossed my mind. I did not think that was an option. And she said, "No, you're talented. I can help you audition for schools here in Texas if you want to get a music degree." And so I was like, "All right." Once again, I was like, "Okay, let's do it." So someone else just guiding me along the way. And so I had auditioned at U of H, Texas State, and UT, and I fell in love with Miss Bridget Bellini at Texas State. And
Yes.
so, yeah, ended up going there. And so I did my undergrad in vocal performance, and then I had that realization when I graduated of, I don't know if I see myself, lining up gigs and going through the stress of living out of a suitcase and, not really knowing what your income is going to be that year. And even though I loved performing, I still love performing. I even tell people that I'm a singer before I am a conductor even today. And my approach to conducting is I am always a singer first. And so then I went to Dr. Jonathan Babcock after I graduated. I was like, "Dr. Babcock, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't want to be a performer." And then once again, I was lucky to have an educator that was like, "Well, you were a natural in conducting class. Could you see yourself doing that?" And I was like, "Well, I never thought of that." And that moment I was like, choir was the initial love, like that was the initial passion whenever I was in high school. And so he said, "We'll accept you into the program right now if that's what you want to do." And so I was like, "All right, let's do it." And so, yeah, so then I started the master's program at Texas State for choral conducting. And it was throughout those couple of years that I realized everything lined up, and that was what I was meant to do. I was meant to be a choir director. And more specifically, I fell in love with collegiate teaching because again, I had these amazing mentors that just really helped guide me. And there were so many barriers that I faced, being first generation and not even thinking that that was an option for me to begin with, going back to high school. And so then it was that moment that I knew, okay, well, now I want to get my doctorate and I want to work in higher education, and I want to do I want to give my students that same support system that got me through college. And so now I'm the director of choral studies at New Mexico State University doing the thing.
Yes, yes, I love this. I love this. This is awesome. Very, very cool. So, part of your research involves diversifying musical spaces, especially choral performances. And can you share a little bit about why you were inspired to study this specific topic?
Yeah. So I was raised knowing about my indigenous ancestry. I am Yaqui, which is an indigenous tribe from the northwestern part of Mexico, Sonora. And so my dad raised me knowing about my ancestry. But whenever you're younger, like your parents, they tell you things orally and like you listen, but sometimes you don't really hear them, like you're just young and dumb. And so sometimes the things just don't really sink in the way that they're meant to. And as a child, I was always, fascinated with everything Native American. Like I can remember making bows and arrows with my dad, like him teaching me things like that. And somewhere along the way, it just kind of got lost through my education. And when you look at the way curriculums are designed in the United States, it's kind of meant to do that, right? You
Yeah,
know, we
absolutely.
we we learn through a colonial lens. And when you don't see yourself represented in curriculum, sometimes you forget and you become programmed through that colonial lens. And so through college, I was just surviving, right? And when you're 18 and on, you're living on your own for the first time, you're having to worry about paying your bills and all of that, sometimes you kind of lose, you know, you're finding your identity and in my case, like throughout my education, my identity got lost. And so in 2020, there was a really pivotal moment. And I think for everyone, the whole nation, really, you think of Black Lives Matter and the spotlight that was put on systemic issues and things integrated into the institutions around us. Like there was just a huge nationwide awakening in the United States, right? And so in 2020, a couple of months before my father passed away, he randomly had this deep conversation with me out of nowhere. And he said, Stephanie, don't ever forget who your great grandpa was and what he did, your Yaqui blood. And, he was telling me all of the things that, again, I grew up being told these stories. I knew this since childhood. And so I'm listening to him, telling me all of these things about our ancestry and being indigenous. And when he passed away a couple of months later, this is literally in the depths of Black Lives Matter and everything that was going on. My mind immediately went back to that conversation that he had with me. And in that moment, there was just like this awakening. There was like this epiphany where I realized, oh my God, like throughout my education, and even more specifically, my collegiate education, I have been sleeping, eating, and breathing the culture of literally my ancestors' colonizers. And I have never seen myself represented in the curriculum. And in the depths of my education and just focusing on I want to develop my technique and I want to be, an amazing singer and I want to be an amazing conductor and I love Bach, I love, Vivaldi, like I love Baroque music and, etc. Through the curriculum though, I had completely become detached and lost who I was and my identity. And so in that moment, I realized, there were all of these barriers for me, being first generation and everything that I was taught since childhood to never forget who you are. I had done exactly that. And that was the moment where I realized, wow, how many other people are like me where this has happened in their education, you don't realize it, because you become so consumed at, I want to be better. I want to be better. I
Yeah.
want to keep learning and learning. And then you're like, wait, I'm learning and learning, but I'm learning through the scope of a colonial education.
Yeah, it's all about there's that saying, it's the water that you swim in and you get used to the water that you're swimming in where it eventually seems normal, right? Where it's which we have normalized it, right? In kind of Western classical music education that this is the way you learn how to sing. This is the kind of music you sing in choir. And I think, especially as someone who's in, more of like the voice teaching space, I mean, you hear people say, like, oh, belting is so unhealthy and, you should never do that. I mean, I've had teachers tell me that before, and it's like, belting, it literally has its roots in Africa. I mean, like, cultures have been belting for generations. Like, what do you
Right.
mean? It's like, what do you mean it's unhealthy? I hear you, and I really appreciate that perspective because I think it needs to be talked about, and I appreciate all of that.
Going off of what you said, I mean, it hurts everyone, right? Because, if you're someone who has this passion for belting, this interest, like what you just said, and then you're told, no, that's unhealthy, like, well, then, it goes beyond just like demonizing things that are tied to certain cultures. Everyone loses that way because then you're told these things that if you have this interest, that has literally been proven to not be unhealthy because these people have been doing it for centuries upon centuries, you're shut down in that way to even be able to explore your instrument in these different ways.
Yes, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Oh gosh, I could like talk about this forever. Some critiques of the classical music world are that it's elitist and classist, going off of what we were just talking about. And I know that some singers that come into my studio say that they don't want to study classical music because of the sense of elitism that they get from that path of study. Now, since some of your research has delved into this topic, can you discuss a little bit of the history behind how we got to this point where basically the Western classical model is like the best way to study?
Oh man, it is.
I
We're
know
gonna
that's like a
peel it.
loaded question.
We're gonna peel apart an onion. Okay, this is very nuanced. The initial easy answer is okay. Well, colonization, right? The music that we have that is deemed classical was brought over through colonization, right? It was brought across seas and established here in the United States. That's why we have these traditions here, right? So that's just the beginning though. Now, that's an obvious answer. If you look at the United States and you flash forward to around mid 1700s to the mid 1800s, the public theater as it existed then was actually a very diverse space. And when I say diverse, I mean it in every sense of the word. You had poor people, rich people, people of different racial backgrounds, ancestries, all congregating the public theater. But not only the people were diverse, but also the presentation on the public stage was diverse. So you could kind of think of it resembling more of what a popular music concert, and I'll explain why I'm using quotations, but what a popular music concert looks like today. So if you went to the public theater during that time, you would maybe see an orchestra play some popular American folk tunes of the time, followed by a juggling act, followed by maybe you heard a choir ensemble that maybe did some more something more Western European. And then maybe after that, you would see an act of farce, like a comedy act. Then maybe after that, you would see excerpts of a ballet. So you would see dancing. And so the performances were very multi-genre, very interdisciplinary, and it, it it was a very diverse and immersive experience. And Americans flocked to these venues, and it created this shared, very unique American cultural experience. Well, in the 1800s, music criticism takes off, and the first American music critic was John Sullivan Dwight. And so during this time that John Sullivan Dwight starts being this prominent music critic, these multi-genre diverse performances are happening. And a good example of this would be the National Peace Jubilee in the 1800s. There were 40,000 people from across the United States that came to this performance. There were 20,000 performers. So that tells you the grand scope of what some of these performances and organized events were like. They truly were a shared culture during this time. Well, John Sullivan Dwight, he codified the term classical music. So this term was made in the United States. And so what he meant by the term classical music was it should be centered around Western European music. It should be viewed as a higher art form than, in his words, lowly music. And he criticized Black musicians, poor musicians. So those who suffer the most from this terminology that he codified and spearheaded were Black, Indigenous, minority, and impoverished people of the United States. And so these terms as they exist, and this is why I use quotes when I use these terms, popular music and classical music, is that they were codified and defined the way that they were for a reason. And so elite circles in the United States, they got on board with Dwight, and they were totally behind this separation of classical music. This is what this experience should be like. He believed that classical music meant that you should be an obedient audience member. You shouldn't need ballet, farce, juggling acts. You shouldn't need these multi-genre, multidisciplinary performances to be entertained. That you should be able to walk into a concert hall and admire the pure genius and complexity of classical music, and that it should be completely separate from these other genres and disciplines because it is that philosophical genius and complex, right? So, as this is all going on, these elite circles, they're on board with everything Dwight is saying in his music critic publications. Theaters began to be funded by these elite circles. One of them is, as you can probably guess, the Metropolitan Opera. And so these theaters like the Met, they're funded, they're built, and their sole purpose is to uplift this refined musical experience of classical music. With that came dress code and high ticket prices. Well, an example of this separation of audiences is notable in the Astor House riot, which was in 1849. So the Astor Opera House was one of these elite venues that was built in the 1800s. And that's what it became immediately known for, was that they had a very specific dress code and extremely high ticket prices. So only these elite people could go and enjoy this venue. Well, immigrants and native activists, they had a massive riot in 1849. Like 30 people died. There were over 100 people that were injured. It was this huge riot that happened. And it was because they realized, like, we are being culturally alienated. This special experience that the United States has been cultivating with the public theater is now being completely segregated.
This is just like I want to hear more and I'm excited to hear more, but it's just like as you're saying these things, I trust you because I know that all study with Dr. Lipton and I know that you're like music history guru here and it's like also how do we not hear about a lot of these things in just our education? I mean, of course like you've got the internet, you've got books that you can look at, you can read about these things, but it's just like I think that when we think of concert etiquette, going to a classical music concert, I feel like we were taught, okay, you have to dress this way, you have to act this way, and we don't question those things. Like, we just think that
Mhm.
that's how it's always been. And the truth is that that's not how it's always been. It's like,
Yeah, it wasn't.
and it's so interesting how all of this kind of unfolded. I mean, it makes perfect sense because it's just like another example of wealthy elites kind of separating themselves into a space where they don't have to interact with poor people or people from lower classes and things like that. And it's just like another way to separate themselves and distinguish themselves. And I mean, it makes perfect sense, but it's also just like, wow, how do we not talk about these things?
Right, right. It's insane that we do learn all of these things about the Western canon, the traditions, but it's never taught in our curriculum of how those traditions were spread specifically throughout the United States because that's where we are. So like how did it come to exist here? And that's this part of music history is just completely left out, which it's like, why? Because all this took place in the romantic era that we study so heavily in music history courses. But it's always, well, this is what was happening in the romantic era over there. Well, what was happening here in the United States? Because we're studying this tradition, this genre of music, but how did it come to be here? So yeah, it's really interesting how that gets, left out. You would think it would be more honed in on since that's where we are is in the United States. But yeah, so that riot is very exemplary of the separation that was happening, the intense separation that was happening in the 1800s. And so like you said, the concert etiquette, how you dress, all of those things were established in these conversations, this rhetoric that was going on during the time. And even if you look at the more racist part of that century in the 1800s, United States, minstrel shows, right? Well, the whole point was characterizing Black music. And for John Sullivan Dwight, that was the exact music that he too was demonizing. And so the African American spiritual that minstrel shows were mimicking, the very people it was mimicking, that was what was deemed popular by John Sullivan Dwight. So these two terms were very codified for two different types of people, two different types of US citizens, right? And so then you look at the university system. Prior to the 1800s, colleges were established by religious denominations, and their primary goal was to educate men to become ministers. So then you realize, oh well, the collegiate system was built for a certain person, right? And the modern sense of a university as we know it today didn't start to flourish until mid late 1800s. So then you realize, wow, our curriculums are not that old. Like this is a very still relatively new institution that we exist in educationally. And that is why our curriculums look the way they do, because when these universities were established, these music schools within these universities were established, they were established around this idea of John Sullivan Dwight's definition of classical music. And that is why we study and learn the tradition of concert etiquette. This is how you dress, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all built into the very definitions as we know it. And for people to sense that, even if they aren't embedded into our industry, for them to sense that, of course they will. Those connotations, they're there and they're very obvious. If you were to go on Oxford Music Online and you look up the term popular music, it will literally tell you that it is music for uneducated audiences, whereas classical music is for the elite. It's right there on the database that we use as music majors to research.
Oh my god. It's just like it's so crazy. Oh man, all of this I just have so many thoughts and it's just like how we were talking about earlier how things like belting kind of get looked down upon or it's like how you're told that it's unhealthy to belt and that sort of thing and then how like popular music is looked down upon as this kind of lesser art when it's really
Mhm.
it's all music, it's all art, it all has beauty in it and it's just like we really did this to ourselves, didn't we? Like,
Right. Yeah.
oh gosh.
Yeah. And it really, it shows you why popular concerts are presented in the way that they are today. And it's because the public theater, as I outlined it, from the mid 1700s to the mid 1800s, that is what the public theater looked like. It was a spectacle.
Like these
And
huge arenas like filled up with people
right,
watching the show.
right.
Yeah.
You know, the National Peace Jubilee, like 20,000 performers and a 40,000 person audience. Like it was a huge thing,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why in that divide, we see the presentation of these two music the way that they are. That is why.
Mhm. Yeah. It's just it's so wild. And it's like it's so interesting sometimes when I am talking to students about like I always hate to disclaim myself like this or but I'll basically delineate between classical music or classical style of singing versus non-classical music or non-classical. And it's so crazy because they'll be like, "Well, what does that mean non-classical?" I'm like, "It's literally everything that is not classical," which is it's so crazy that it's like literally that contains so many different genres of music and it's just like how
Don't get me started on the word art song. So no other song is art. Not you.
For real, for real. I really enjoy this conversation and just like learning about the history behind all of this. I feel that if people don't learn about where things come from or they don't learn about the history behind certain things, then we just continue the same old patterns. Like there's really
Mhm.
no progressive way forward. And so I really appreciate all of this, but kind of maybe thinking more to the present, what do you think are some steps that we can take individually and collectively to decolonize classical music? Or really just decolonizing music in general and make it more accessible to the general public? Like
Yeah.
how do we kind of begin to break down these kinds of barriers between like, okay, this is classical music and it is proper music, and here is non-classical music which is not proper. Like how do we begin? I mean, it's such a big and heavy topic,
Right.
but what are things that you think about when it comes to that?
You know, the first thing that comes up for people is, well, you diversify. You diversify repertoire. You uphold composers who have been oppressed, marginalized, underrepresented in our field, right? But for some people, they're like, oh, okay, check, like,
Like the token spiritual that's part of like the TMEA All-State Music
yeah,
Award.
yeah, 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 yeah. They're like, oh, okay, let's end with a spiritual by a Black composer, and they're like, done, done. So it becomes unauthentic, it's very disingenuous, because it becomes a checkbox. So along with diversifying, what you have to do is you have to deprogram yourself. You have to completely eliminate the idea that everything you have been taught about classical music is genius or so complex that it is the music that is worthy of study. That is the biggest thing is you have to deprogram yourself, and you have to be willing to, on your own time, explore music of other cultures, music of people that don't look like you, and be able to appreciate just everything on an equal field, and being able to realize that there is inherent beauty and teachable things in all music. And that especially, it is not just inherent to music of the Western art canon. Like the justification of why we center Western European music is that, oh, organized music making, it's not found in other cultures like it was in Western Europe. Well, there are murals in Mexico, Mayan murals, one of them in Bonampak, Mexico. And these murals literally depict organized music making in pre Hispanic indigenous tribes. And when I say organized music making, I'm saying you literally see in these murals a Native American flute section, a percussion section. You see literal sections, like,
Yeah.
like it's orchestrated. It is quite literally organized music making. And, unfortunately, so much of that history was burned away through colonization. So it's not unique to Western music. There are beautiful musical traditions in all cultures. And the more we can deprogram ourselves and pull ourselves away, because I like what I was saying before, where I completely lost myself in my education. I am one of the first people where I'm like, I love Bach. And there was a time where I would have said that Bach is one of the most genius people ever. There was a time where I would have said that. But as I deprogrammed myself and brought myself back to Stephanie, you completely lost your identity through this programming of a colonial education. Um, you look at music of other cultures and you realize, holy bleep, there is so much beauty and complexity in all music, period. I programmed this concert called Spirituals to Jazz this past semester. And I gave my students a transcription of an Earth, Wind, and Fire song. You should have seen their faces when they saw the rhythms written on the page. Like,
Though that is to say that I feel like sometimes with pop music, if a student comes in and they want to work on a song and I'll purchase the music from like Music Notes or something, sometimes when they transcribe it, it's like so can
yeah,
empathize with that for sure. But like
yeah. So there's complexity and teachable things in all music, right? I mean, if we pull out choral music from the Renaissance era, all you're gonna see is probably quarter notes and eighth notes, right? Nothing crazy,
yeah.
but we make it seem like, oh my God, it's so complex. Like it's modal, quarter notes and eighth notes. Like, come on now. So diversify, but with that, you need to deprogram yourself and you need to expose yourself and really analyze your biases that you have, right? The third thing would be detach yourself as much as you can from the terms classical and popular. My students know by now that every time I say the word classical or popular, they always see me do this. And they know what that means. They know why I put it in quotes. And they know that I hate those terms and that I think music is just music. I am not a classical musician. I'm a choral musician. So the more that we can specify in that way, the better off we are. I'm not in the medium of classical music. I'm in the medium of choral singing. And that could
Yes.
mean anything. It could mean that I go on music notes and I have a choral arrangement of Billie Eilish. That's choral music, right?
Yeah.
It could mean anything. It could mean that I program a Bulgarian folk song where they sing in a timbre with a lowered soft palate, bright nasal resonance. They smile through every vowel. It's a completely different way of singing. Is that classical or is that popular?
Right? Yeah.
That's
Well, I like what you were saying. It's like music is just music and there's inherent beauty in all of it. And I feel like some people might listen to this and listen to us talk about this and they're like, oh God, but there's just so much music out there. Like, where do I start? And I feel like it all goes to, well, what are you curious about? Like, what interests you as you're like listening to music? And, sometimes people will tell me, they're like, well, I only listen to country music and like, that's it. And that's fine. People have their own tastes and preferences. But it's
Mhm.
like, even within like the country genre, there are elements within country that, date back to like spirituals or like have jazz elements or R&B elements in it. It's like, if it
Yeah.
interests you, if it piques your ear and you're like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know, dig deeper. There's so much music out there to just kind of explore. And if it piques your interest, learn more about it, listen to it, learn the history behind it. And did you have anything else to add to that? Or was that
No, I would say those are the three big ones. Yeah.
nice? Awesome. One last, like, formal question, kind of for funsies, kind of, we can get as hot as we want to get here, but what are some of your hot takes when it comes to singing or the choral music space? Anything that you haven't touched upon already? I know that we've kind of.
This whole thing has been a hot take. I would say there's two things for me. It's one, going back to this, what is the proper way to sing? What is healthy? What is unhealthy? I think that we really set students up for failure when they get a vocal performance degree, the way that it stands in our curriculum. Because as you were saying, like, you have people that are like, oh, don't mess with, my bel canto teaching, this is the healthy way, da 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 da. Katie Whitbeck is a great example of this. She had her undergrad in vocal performance and now she sang with the Navy band. And now she's out of the Navy. She finished her contract and now she's just gigging with bands all over Virginia. And on top of that, she still does church gigs where she's singing classical style, right? And so I think that we really set up vocal performance majors for failure when we only teach them one thing. Like
Yeah.
you're a one trick pony. You're sending them out into a field that is overpopulated. They still have to pay to sing for young artist programs, et cetera, et cetera. And I tell my students, if you see a jazz gig in town, they're looking for a singer and they're paying money. Are you really going to skip out on that audition just because you were trained classically? I tell them that, period, point blank, the only thing that denotes healthy vocal production is proper breathing, proper use of the breathing mechanism, and relaxation.
Right? And that's how I like to frame it, is like, what is sustainable versus what is unsustainable? Like, what can you actually sustain and what is going to cause you fatigue and strain? It's like, rather than kind of saying, oh, this is healthy or this is unhealthy or this is the right way to sing and this is the wrong way to sing. And I think that, more and more singers are kind of waking up to the idea that, yeah, hey, I got to diversify my skill set, because you're right. There's just like, especially for like sopranos, for example, there's just an
Right.
abundance of sopranos out there in the classical space. And it's like, and it's crazy too, because I think of, you know, basically post grad school, what I've been working on over these last couple of years, which is really learning from teachers that are teaching non-classical styles, that are teaching pop rock, and learning about these different techniques. And I wish we did teach more of this in like a typical vocal performance degree, because you think of the phrase like vocal performance, that title, it's like, well, you should be able to perform like different style. Like, it's like, why does that just
Yeah.
mean one style of music? Because then, I've had to spend money over the last couple of years, hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars, just getting more tools in my toolkit.
Mhm.
And this is not to say that I regret any of my education. I loved Texas State. I loved going to
Yeah.
George Mason. They taught me how to sing, like for real,
Mhm.
but getting different tools, I think you're right in that it would be worth thinking about. And I think that some schools are doing that. I know, like here in Richmond at VCU, there are teachers that are teaching not only classical but also musical theater and maybe a little bit of pop in there too. So it's like,
Mhm.
I think that there are music departments and schools that are kind of waking up to that fact, like, oh hey,
Right. Yeah.
we gotta help our singers be more marketable.
Mhm.
But I definitely think we need to keep pushing for it to be a more widespread thing,
Mhm.
widespread practice. Did you have another hot take? I know you said two hot takes. Was that basically touching upon both of them, or was there another one in there?
Yeah, the other one I would say is, um, what you should look like. I think is another big thing. Like, I can think back to undergrad where I was fearful of having a tattoo, and that to be professional, I had to dress a certain way. I had to look a certain way. And it goes back to this idea that in our field we have to be refined, you know? What other musicians are held to that standard, you know? Like, people are able to appreciate, like, the artistic outward expression of other, pop icons or whatever, whoever, Beyonce, whoever it is, right? But then when it comes to us, I feel like oftentimes we feel this need to like fit in this professional box, which who decided that? Like what we should look like, how we should act. I've been called ghetto. Like
I mean,
so
it's like it goes back to like who created that box? It just like is so frustrating, because it's like I've thought about that as well, where it's like I think about how I dress for work sometimes, and I mean, like, look, I've got like a little vest on and like a like
no
freaking tank top,
sleeves.
or no sleeves. That's like literally the thought that I had the first time I put this on. I was like, should I wear something with sleeves? And I was like, this is my studio. This is my workplace. I was like, I don't know that the fashion police is coming in here or the professional police is coming in here and saying, you can't dress that way. Like, I think it even goes back to like the school system too, because I remember being
Mhm.
in high school and like, you couldn't wear shorts a certain length, or like, dye your hair a certain color or whatever. That was like another thing that you couldn't do when I was in high school and
Mhm.
whatnot. Like, especially with the shorts thing. Okay, I'll go off on a little tangent for a second, because I had some long legs, and that was frustrating, because I was like, how is it that this other girl can wear the same pair of shorts that I can wear, but I can't? But it's like, because I have long arms. It's like, okay. But anyway, it's frustrating, and it's like, I think that you're a really good example of redefining what that looks like, and breaking those barriers, and like breaking down those ideas of like, oh, you have to look a certain way to be a professional musician. It's like me looking a certain way, or like having a tattoo, says nothing about my skills as a musician or as a
Mhm.
collaborator, right? But
Or
yes.
your skills as an educator, like,
Yeah.
hello, like, that's what matters, like, are my students retaining the information that I'm teaching them? Like, are they highly engaged with my teaching style? And I went to a choir concert a couple of years ago, and everyone was filing on to the risers and their concert black. And there was this woman who was wearing it was like a mesh type of long sleeve blouse. And so it was see through, but it was like embroidered with like
Oh,
a floral pattern. So like you couldn't see anything. You could barely even see her bra, you know?
yeah.
But like, on some of her shoulder, her chest, her sides, there were some parts where you could see like her skin through the mesh fabric. And the people next to me were having a conniption fit about this blouse. They were like, how unprofessional, like she should be covered, blah, 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 blah. These were not old people.
Okay, that was my
Mind you.
first thought. I was like,
No,
"Oh,
no, no. And I was just like, I did not feel like I was distracted. I did not feel like it drew away from the performance. I actually loved her outfit. And you know what? I would love to go to like someone's solo recital and see them do it in Doc Martens and rib jeans. Like, I would love that. In fact, I don't even understand why it upsets people so much, because if the whole experience of classical music is that you're there to just listen, why do you care about what I'm wearing? I thought the music was so genius and philosophical that you didn't need to see anything. Close your eyes.
right? It goes back to that idea of deprogramming, right? Where it's like clearly your perception of how classical music or how music should be presented, you clearly have a certain idea of what is appropriate and what is professional.
Mhm.
And it's like, who defined those standards for you? Where did you learn that? And it's very interesting for
Yeah.
sure. Well, I would love to kind of end things with a little bit of rapid fire. Are you ready for some rapid fire?
Okay, that sounds scary.
It's just a few quick questions. So the first one is coffee or tea?
Dessert coffee. If it's not loaded with caramel, chocolate drizzle, I don't want
I love it. Okay. What is a song that you've been playing on repeat lately?
it. Chihiro, Billie Eilish.
Oh, nice. That is such a good song. I love that. That's a really good album too. I bought it on vinyl and I really dig
Yeah.
it. It's a
Oh,
good
it's
one.
so good.
It's really good. What is your favorite book? Only because I'm like a big bookworm and I'm always looking for new recommendations.
Oh God. Everything I've read has been academic lately. I need to do some leisurely reading. I need to get back into it because everything has been academic and it's awful. But I will say two books that are sitting on my desk right now that I think every music educator should read, point blank, um, is Culturally Responsive Teaching in Music Education.
Nice. Okay.
And they're both published by Routledge, and Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies in Music Education.
Nice.
These two books are incredible, and you can see they're not that big,
Yeah, no, they're pretty slim. That's good.
but they're quick reads, and I think every music educator should have to read these two books. And they touch on a lot of the things that we talked about today, and things about our biases towards, specific singing styles, and
Mm.
they're great books. But
Awesome. I love it. This is good. This is good. My next question is, what is a TV show that you're currently watching or binging?
so I just started Love Island
Okay, I need to ask you, how do you watch that on Peacock or do you watch that on cable? How do you watch that?
on Peacock. Yeah.
Okay, I was like, do I want to invest in a Peacock subscription for like a month just to like watch that? I was
I
maybe.
yeah, I have been getting into those just raunchy, mind-numbing dating shows like Netflix,
Yes.
The Ultimatum. That's the one that I binge watched most recently, was The Ultimatum. The queer and the heterosexual one. Like, I binged both of them. I just I eat up the drama, and it
The
makes me feel
first
better about myself.
The only one I've seen of The Ultimatum was the first season, but that was, like, enough for me because I was like, "This is crazy. This is insane." That we love our Love is Blind, and we're watching The Bachelorette right now because it's just so funny. Like, I don't know, it's like it's also interesting. I always think of it as, like, a study in seeing how people interact with each other, and,
Yeah.
like, how they communicate or don't communicate, and it's like,
Mhm.
wow, I'm really learning something? So that's okay. My next question is if you could eat one food or dish for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Menudo.
Oh,
Menudo.
yeah.
A
Nice.
1000%. It's one of those dishes that I grew up on that it could be any meal of the day. Breakfast, lunch, or dinner, like, it's
Yeah.
just versatile, you know?
Yes. Yum. The last one is what is the best singing advice you've ever gotten?
You know, Miss Bellini, I was really fortunate with her at Texas State because, some of the things that we've been talking about, she was very much not like that. She actually would do workshops during summers on teaching belting and things
Oh,
like that. And so I was really fortunate with her in that some of the things that we talked about, she very much was all about, Um, there were times where I wanted to come in and sing something pop for her because I really enjoy like recording little covers and just for funsies, and I do some songwriting and stuff. And so I there were times where I would want to bring something to her and she was always down for it. And so I think it goes back to what we were talking about of just being a diverse singer, right? Really expanding your skill sets and being able to experiment with your voice in the most extreme ways possible.
yeah.
The human voice is capable of so much, and the more that you explore those extremities of what your voice can do, the better off you are. And um, something that parallels what we do is like voice acting, you know? We're
Yeah.
we're we're just voice actors that are doing it on pitch. And
Right.
so if voice actors can make these crazy character sounds like SpongeBob, Patrick, or
Yeah.
Rick and Morty, all of these, little character voices, we can do the same thing with our voice. We're capable of so much. Um, so I would say that was the best advice was, having a voice teacher that was all about being diverse with your instrument.
Yes. I love it. Love it. Well, Dr. Stephanie Reyes, thank you so much for coming on the No Wrong podcast. This was an amazing conversation. I feel like we only scratched the surface of some of the
Right.
things we could talk about. Oh man, but thank you so much. I really appreciated this conversation for sure.
Thank you. This was so fun.